Sego, everybody. So this week, week 7, first week of March, we're going to be talking about reciprocity, relationships, and the gift economy. So I'm actually going to, no, we'll do this. So I want to kind of help make, the connection between what we did in week 6, where we looked at environmental violence and resistance to it, and then, why resist? And I think that during, those of you who were there or watched it after, during Amanda's talk, it got quite emotional, and I think that we can hear from a person who's experiencing this kind of resistance that emotional attachment to the lands that goes way beyond just seeing the land as a thing that we can own. And we've talked about that before, and we've read about it, but I think that hearing from somebody who lives this directly, I think is it brings it home. And so when we talk about environmental violence as violence on the land being something that's also violence on Indigenous peoples themselves, again, that really drives it home. And they explained that quite well. So people are a part of the land, not above it. And so, there was this whole question of, if you consider yourself as being related to the land and the animals and the waters and the plants, then you're going to experience that violence that is inflicted on them as something that's also inflicted on you. And so that Indigenous resistance isn't about land ownership as in the way that it's commonly portrayed in mainstream media. They're fighting for ownership because they were there first. It goes beyond that. It's about survival, okay? Because if we see ourselves as being related to each other as humans, we're related to whatever group we belong to, our family, our community, and whatnot, and then we extend that idea of family and community to beings that are not human, then that kind of expands our understanding of that resonance of violence, right? I think that a lot of us already feel this sense of connection to some other people in our lives, where if something bad happens to them, it's also happening to us. We experience it with them. So it's kind of the same thing, except that we're also talking about beings that are not human. So, there's a lot of beauty in resistance, and I wanted us to kind of hear from that side of things where there's active resistance. But violence itself is an ugly topic, and so this was, for a lot of people, I'm guessing, and not all of you will talk about this necessarily. It might come out in your journals, but it might have been quite emotional. And some of the readings, even in preparation for Amanda's talk, were maybe difficult for some of you. So this week we're still kind of on the topic of those kinds of relationships, but we're going to look at it from a place of beauty, and that'll help us kind of come back to this and think again, to revisit this idea of why it's important to support resistance. Now I'm going to leave this PowerPoint for a minute, and I'm actually going to go to this week's reading questions, because I gave a little intro here. Now, as I mentioned in the instructions for the quiz that's due on Monday, I'm trying to give you make the work this week a little bit more manageable. So there's only one thing to read, and but it's something that's quite beautiful, and I think helps kind of counterbalance some of the stuff we read about this past week, week 6. It's still week 6 for me, and you might be seeing this during week 7. So Robin Wall Kimmerer, I'm not sure if that's how she says it, and this is her kind of self-bio from the article that you're going to be reading, and this is a picture of her. I'm trying to get into the habit of showing you the people that you're reading. I didn't do that at the beginning, but I'm trying to do that more because I think it's nice to be able to put faces to names. So the article in question is called "The Serviceberry: An Economy of Abundance." And it's quite a beautiful reading. It's a bit long, but you're not going to have to read the whole thing. And there's also an option to listen to it because she actually narrates it, so that's really neat. And the reading is going to give you an opportunity to learn about the worldview of a different First Nation than the one we've been focusing on, or the set of nations we've been focusing on, which has been mostly Haudenosaunee, those 6 nations that share a lot of cultural traits. And we'll come back to Haudenosaunee material, more specifically Ganyenkihaga, at some point. But it's nice to, and we will also talk about Anishinaabe and Inuit. We can't talk about all the nations, but we'll try to include a few. Robin Wall Kimmerer is of the Potawatomi Nation, so and this is kind of, a lot of this is rooted in her culture's worldview, but also in her experience as a botanist who professionally works, with different kinds of plants. So we'll get that. We'll get that, and there are similarities between different First Nations cultures, different Indigenous cultures, but a lot of it has to do with where people are, because Indigenous cultures are so rooted in the land where they've emerged from. In Amanda's words, a lot of the worldviews are specific to the locations where their ancestral territories lie. So she kind of comes with that perspective, and brings us deeper into what I'm saying here is this web of understanding that looks very closely at how humans can learn from, as she puts it, other citizens. With whom humans are related. So it's a very poignant way of learning how people conceive of these relationships, and how that extends to ideas about reciprocity, gratitude, and generosity. So this week you're going to be reading a part of this article. It's a bit long, so you only need to read until you're going to see there throughout the text there are these big letter quotations. One of them is, what if scarcity is just a cultural construct, a fiction that fences us off from gift economies? You can stop there for this assignment. If you want to read the whole thing, that's great, but you don't have to. And so you'll also see that big quotation is just above the third image that's on the page, if you start counting with the one at the very top. The imagery is beautiful. It's a very beautiful artwork that has a lot to do with what's in the article, so take a moment to admire that as well. And if you prefer to listen, or you want to listen and read at the same time, if that works for you, at the very top there's a button where you can click, and she's narrating her own writing, and she does this in a beautiful way. It's not monotonous at all, so those of you who are verbal learners can do that. And you can stop when you hear, what if scarcity is just a cultural construct. Same thing. So your questions are here, and so they're three, but they're all based on the same thing, and they're all interrelated. So and there's no quiz this week. I'm giving you a break from the vocabulary quizzes because you're already doing that big one. Okay, so let's go back to this. So I wanted to kind of look at that with you during this particular presentation, because I like to help make that bridge where we looked at this stuff from the point of view of resisting violence, and the Robin Wall Kimmerer's article is more about affirming beauty in relationships. So I thought that would be a little uplifting and a nice place for us to go. So here she is again, like, she's a botanist of the Potawatomi Nation, and here is the link as well in the PowerPoint to the article if you're starting from here. And so the main thing she's talking about here is this idea of a gift economy. And as you're reading, I'd like you to pay attention to the worldview that is expressed in her explanation. And this worldview touches on a whole bunch of things, but here we're going to focus on worldviews about how humans relate to each other, how different living beings relate to each other, and how the things that nourish us circulate in society. So when she's explaining what the gift economy is, with this whole idea of, instead of being guided by this idea of hoarding because you're afraid you're going to run out, it's to just give freely, right? And build those relationships. And when you give, you're strengthening relationships, and that's going to come back to you. Okay, those of you who took Introduction to Anthropology might remember the concept of reciprocity, and we'll talk about that in these slides when we get to that typical anthropological concept slides. But she actively talks about it, and it's interesting because there are different ways to look at reciprocity. But really, that idea is that we're not using money, we're not paying for stuff. We don't need to. We can, it's kind of a way of expressing sharing, right? But it goes deeper than just this one-off thing. It's really about ongoing relationships. And you can also pay attention to, and I don't want to give too much away because she explains it so beautifully, and I can't really do it justice in just these kind of bare bones slides. So try to pay attention too to how she talks about trees, berries, insects, and birds, and how, you know, how that's different than what we're used to. Maybe it's like, okay, they're living things, they're out there, but often we see them either as they're just kind of part of the landscape, you know, these things we can kind of admire if we're into it or whatever, or things like, you know, berries, for example. We see them as commodities, maybe like food, something you can buy at the supermarket. Some kinds of birds as well, right? Like chicken, turkey, but in the way that they're referred to in this article, well, are they just commodities, or are they living beings with agency, like their own role to play in the unfolding of things in this web of relationships between living things? You can also, you know, when we think about relationships, what's interesting to see in this article too is how does the discussion of relationships between people and between people and the things that nourish us, how is it different in this model than the one that we learn in a typical economics class? Those of you who are in social science and commerce, you all had to take, I think, I always forget, is it macro or microeconomics? Anyway, there's one of those you have to take. Maybe some of you are taking more, especially if you're in commerce. So the vision of relationships between humans in that typical model is more about antagonism. It's like, hey, we have to make sure they don't get our stuff, and because we need to make sure we have stuff and we have enough stuff, and if they have stuff too, that's fine as long as they don't take our stuff. And this is kind of antagonism, and it's often portrayed as though this is a natural state of being and that humans have always just naturally been that way. It also goes with that whole warfare mentality. And so, but in the way she explains the gift economy, there's a very different way to be, and this is a very ancient way to be that predates colonialism, it predates capitalism, any, you know, kind of structure that most of us are familiar with. And how can we learn from the berries themselves about relationships that are enabled through a gift economy? Now, this might sound kind of strange, what I can learn from berries, but again, when we think about indigenous worldviews about things that are alive, it's not this hierarchy between humans and other living beings. There are relationships of reciprocity that are similar to the relationships of reciprocity between people. So this, I can't drive this home enough, but this is really, it permeates our entire argument, right? So when I said, you know, pay attention to how she refers to other living things as for example, other citizens, or, you know, it's a relationship of respect, right? And there's gratitude built into that, and there's this sense of obligations, like, okay, these are living beings that are gifting us with nourishment, inspiration, all kinds of things. What can we give back, right? So she actually kind of goes into, there's a couple of paragraphs there where she's talking about, okay, this gift economy, we can talk about it in relation to people and people being in a gift economy with each other. But how can we learn about that in terms of the relationships that, say, the trees that the berries grow on have a relationship with insects, and they have this kind of relationship of reciprocity? And with birds as well, right? So each of those living things has a gift to offer the others, and they act together to maintain these relations. And humans enter into that relationship with those beings as well. So it's really beautifully explained. And again, I can't do it justice. She writes it so well. So links with prior material. So you can keep this in mind as you're reading. We can think back to the very first week when we looked at Ohento Kariwa Degwe, the words before all else, and we talked right from the beginning about this idea of having this show of gratitude towards all the things that nourish us in all the possible ways, right? Because nourishment isn't just about food. There's emotional, there's that physical nourishment for sure, but there's also emotional and mental and spiritual nourishment. Again, those 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel, just like with learning and health. So there are connections made there. We've talked multiple times, I think almost every week this has come up, what the relationships between humans, right? We saw that a lot with treaties, right? With treaties being kind of symbolic, or being in parallel, with human relations, right? And also relationships between humans and the land. And I put the land in quotation marks because when we say that, we're referring not just to the ground, but everything that grows in that ground, the waters, beings that fly, all this sort of thing. And also, I'd like to you to reflect on this last week, in week 6, we're talking about exploitation colonialism, settler colonialism, and environmental violence, and how has that interfered with the health of the land, including plants, animals, waters, and so forth, right? So when you think about what's done to the environment, how indigenous people have been displaced from some places so that corporations and governments could grab and develop on that land, sometimes mining, building dams, cutting down trees. How could that hurt the land? Right? So we're thinking back to this idea of environmental violence, but also environmental violence in terms of the health of people. So including physical health, right? So if you pollute the waters, you're also polluting people's drinking water and bathing water. How does it affect people's mental health, their spiritual and emotional health? And so something we'll come back to in future weeks is that idea of holism as applied to human culture. So if we see cultures that are very much based in relationships of reciprocity, such as that exemplified with the gift economy, well then when you interfere with living things that are in that relationship with humans, then you're interfering with human relations. So you're contributing to the breakdown of entire societies. So you see, when we talk about things like multi-generational trauma, it's not just from residential schools. It predates that, because the minute colonizers started interfering with the land base, the ancestral lands, and which indigenous peoples have been in relationships with for millennia, then you are also interfering with the relationships between people. Okay? Partly because you're creating scarcity where it wasn't before. So that's kind of, it starts to kind of help explain that it's not just about taking people and uprooting them and moving them somewhere else and expecting them to just move on with their lives. It's really it's like if you uproot a tree and try to plant it somewhere else, it's not necessarily going to work well, it's not necessarily going to grow as well, because those are not the nutrients in all the senses that it's used to and that it's adapted to. So I guess the last thing here then is looking at some anthropological concepts, and she actually brings some of them up. So this one we've seen before, right? Worldview. Just to remind you, I've talked about worldview a couple times here. We're talking about the way people understand or interpret reality. It goes much deeper than that, right? Worldview, and she mentions at some point, there was a beautiful quote in there. Oh yeah, I wrote it down here. How we think kind of reflects in how we behave, right? So we act on our worldviews. We don't stop to think about it, we just kind of do. So when we talk about the gift economy, or how people conceive of their relationship with each other and the things that they eat, these other living beings, well, they're acting on they're acting on that knowledge that comes from that worldview. Economic systems. So in anthropology, we kind of define economic systems as how resources are distributed in a society or between societies, right? Because societies can trade with each other and do a number of things. So again, even in anthropology is a Western science, right? So it's really that focus on resources, which from the perspective of folks like Robin Wall-Kimmerer, it's not necessarily, we're not looking at things as resources, because that kind of commodifies that. So in anthropology, we're not necessarily thinking of scarcity and like how she says it with like the science of economics, right, that you learn in an economics class. So there's a difference there between the anthropological perspective. So we're getting away from that scarcity model, but it's still thinking in terms of resources, right? Kind of personifying these living things that humans are in a relationship with. She talks about reciprocity, and again, this is something that comes up in an intro to anthropology class. For those of you who took it, if you're in social science and commerce, you had to take that before taking this course. And anthropologists define reciprocity as a distribution system. There are other distribution systems we talk about, but reciprocity specifically is one of those that does not require money. And it's one in which people give in what I call culturally sanctioned ways. So it can look different in different cultural contexts. And you might remember, if you remember something from Intro to Anthropology, depending on who you took it with, sometimes we talk about, say, balanced reciprocity, where there's an expectation in that particular culture where if you give somebody something, they will, not necessarily that same day, but maybe months later, a year later, it depends on the culture, it depends on the nature of the relationship, but they will eventually give you something back of roughly equal value. Not necessarily monetary value, but it can be cultural value, emotional value. And indirect reciprocity, so balanced reciprocity is something we talk about in anthropology. And then often we talked about generalized reciprocity, where there are societies, especially like societies that are very heavily based on hunting and gathering, where they won't grow crops. There's often this tendency to give without expectation that you're necessarily going to get something back from that person you gave to. So maybe you're giving, but everybody in that society, and these are small societies, right? So it works well. If everybody behaves that way, then everybody's going to get something to eat. So maybe person A gives some fish to person B, and maybe person B won't directly give something back to person A, but maybe they'll give to person C. And then things circulate throughout the community in a way that everybody gets something to eat. So everybody's doing this, everybody's participating in it, so people give what they can and they get what they need. And everybody gets something. And at some point, everybody's going to give something in one way or another. And that's really interesting. And I didn't put that here because I like the way and they're not necessarily direct parallels with balanced and generalized reciprocity, but there are some similarities here. So she'll talk about direct reciprocity as, say, giving back to someone. And when I say someone here, I'm kind of following her model too, that this can include a berry or a tree, right? So not just human someones, but any someone. So giving back to someone who gave to the person. So she gave the example, I think, of putting down tobacco, or was that from a different article? There are a lot of First Nations cultures in particular where giving tobacco is a sign of gratitude. Right? But, maybe watering the plant or giving something directly to a person who gave something to you. Indirect reciprocity is kind of similar to that idea of generalized reciprocity, where, like she describes, so maybe somebody gave me some berries, and maybe I'll give some of them to a neighbor, and that neighbor might make a pie and give it to someone else. And in this small, tight-knit community, everybody's going to wind up benefiting somehow. Or she even gave the example of, like, creating a project where you're teaching other people, and that's a gift as well. Or a work of art that is also a gift. Right? So it's very different from that thing of that idea of going to a store and buying an object and giving money and you get it and that's it. It's less transactional. It's more about the relationships. So that's it for this week. I'll stop there. As usual, if you have any questions, let me know. But I really hope you enjoy this reading, or if you choose to listen. It's very beautiful, and again, it's very uplifting, and it can be quite inspiring in terms of looking at alternatives to the system that we're in now. And that, if you continue reading past the point where I'm asking you to read, you'll see that that's what she's getting at, is that there are other ways of doing things. We don't have to be trapped in this way of doing things where some people hoard riches and other people are starving. It doesn't need to be that way. So have a good week.